Thanks. My goodness, Roger, Ellen, Betsy, Louis, Ted. To be understood is itself a great honor. And to hear all those things, as Roger implied, and still be alive, I might say is probably once in a lifetime experience. So thanks. I thought I'd tell you a little bit about what I learned from these two great projects, the rehabilitation of Central Park and the creation and fulfillment of the Rose Space Center. Of course, as Roger said, I'm born and bred in New York, which means you kind of mark your improvement by whether you play punch ball in Central Park, or whether you play softball there, or hardball in the North Meadow, or kickball, or touch football, or even tackle football. And on rainy days, you go to the Museum of Natural History and play hide and seek, of course. And as a special treat, you got to go to the planetarium a couple of times a year. And the park meant Central Park. Now, you meet people who live on West End Avenue, as I did, and my sister and I did years and years ago. But still, we went to the park. Otherwise, we went to Riverside. There's a distinction. And you don't really realize how something becomes a part of you and how you come to love it until someone insults its dignity. And that happened to me as I began to walk through Central Park. You know, I'm a Wall Streeter and worked downtown for years. And around 1970 or so, we moved uptown, and I began to walk. And you couldn't help see the. I mean, Betsy Rogers has, I'm sure, shelves and shelves of before and after pictures, and slides, which she showed audiences, and it's a powerful statement. Let me just tell you that the sheep meadow, that glorious green, I mean, back in 69, 70, it was muddy on a good day. On a bad day, it was underwater altogether. There was no grass there. Remember, this was the age of Mayor Lindsay, Thomas Hoving. The park was for beautiful people. Everybody started a bicycle in the park on weekends. It was a lot of fun. It's just that the manpower of the parkies in Central Park could not keep up with this tremendous growth. In fact, the park department had a decreasingly good reputation. It became known as sort of a rest home, you know, for city employees, a vertical rest home, more or less. And I found walking through the park, they didn't get the weekend stuff cleaned up till Thursday afternoon. And so you had a day and a half until it all began again. So I went and saw the park commissioner at the time, August Hetcher. And I said, you know, maybe I could do a sources and uses of cash study here for Central Park. People don't trust the park department, and yet you could tell lots of money was going to be needed. There weren't any funding organizations. There was one outfit that spent all its time criticizing, and very correctly so, all the horrible things that were going on. And so Commissioner said, sure, why not, you know, kindly gentleman. So I started working away and going over there. The market was not too inspiring, at least my stocks weren't, so I had plenty of time. My office in Columbus Circle, some of my partners are here, and we're still in the same place. Wander over to the Arsenal, you know, at 64th and 5th Avenue, and chatted with various deputies and things. And learned a lot about the park, but began to see that I was never going to get anywhere. I thought we had to make a case on which to go to the public, and we had to have hard numbers. There were no numbers for Central Park. It was all immersed in Borough of Manhattan figures. So this was going to be a hellish job. You would have to back out the employee hours. And I was just wondering how this was going to be accomplished. All of a sudden, some guy walked in, had another chat with the park commissioner. I got a call. This fellow just been back from his native Budapest, and they have parks and islands there. He had some idea about a park, you know, in the East River or something. And they told him there was another crackpot who'd been messing around. Maybe you two guys should get together. So George Soros and I had lunch, and I told him what I was doing, and he seemed interested by the challenge. And of course, George enlarged the scope to be much more than numbers. It transpired that there hadn't been a head count of Central Park visitors for 50 years. They just added 2% a year, you know, population growth. And there hadn't been any kind of management review or survey. And it so happened that a man named Steve Savas had been deputy mayor under Lindsay and gone up to Columbia Business School to help them move into municipal management and that kind of thing. And he was willing to do this and have lots of manpower, women power, and Columbia student power for a year and a half. It cost $150,000. So George and I could scrape up 25. Can you imagine? George had to dig down, and he found a pocket that had 20, and so we came up with 25, with about 50, and as Betsy said, the Astor Foundation and other people, Edmund McConnell Clark, all came across with the other 100, which I helped scare up, and it was kind of fun. And we formed the Central Park Community Fund with the idea that we would try to effectuate the recommendations of this Savas study. A couple of things happened to, as George pointed out, to interrupt this nice fantasy. One was that Mayor Beam was elected. I don't know if many of you remember Abe Beam. He was mayor. He was from Brooklyn. Problem number one, and he disliked parks. Problem number two. So, you know, we were pertinacious anyway, and we kept adding people. We met every couple of weeks. The Avon Products people were very helpful because their building overlooked Central Park. They gave us a little office space. We had Mike Minikis from Bear Stearns. Well, he was a little accounting firm, and Ralph Menapace, our lawyer, who died some years ago, but he was a top guy at Cahill Gordon after a while, and Joan Schwartz and Arthur Ross. We just had a good bunch of people, and we just hit our pick against the rock for 4 years. Abe had 4 successive park commissioners, one a year. So we just get used to one's prejudices, and he was fired, and a new one came. We weren't doing any better. We had 4 successive executive directors. Every time they fired somebody, we fired somebody. And I blame myself, and George blamed me. I mean, we both agreed. But you know something? Here's what I learned from this. The idea kept building anyway. And if you have a good idea, it'll build no matter how you screw it up. And boy, we screwed it up. But the idea kept developing. Our 4th year, we had our most grandiose executive director and our most grandiose project. It was to redo the dairy, that nice structure just south of the 65th Street transfers, where they used to feed milk to kids around 1900. And we put a whole new terrace on it and made it look like the original. There was a $50,000 overrun. Revlon had backed this, really done awfully nicely to back this, but still, what to do about a $50,000 overrun? George came in from Southampton, you know, one July to help us figure this out. So he's very critical, but when you need him, he was there. So that was, you know, a very interesting experience. From this, I can also tell you something else. If you get involved in this kind of stuff, inevitably, not inevitably, but oftentimes you're going to be running into some administrative, state, local, federal, somebody, some agency. And if they're not going to be neutral, congregate elsewhere is what I've learned. Because you can't imagine the effort and the lack of success that we achieved in these 4 years. It wasn't, as George said, because we were entirely incompetent. All that, you know, had something to do with it. But the park department was very suspicious. They were worried about bad publicity. The park looked awful. We tried to help with the different systems for taking garbage. We had systems to improve sewage. Minor things. We liked them. They didn't like them. And so it was a tough 4 years. And then, you know, the sun burst through. Mayor Koch was elected. He appointed Gordon Davis to be park commissioner, a very able lawyer, ambitious, smart. And meanwhile, as Betsy said, the Central Park Task Force had been created by the same Astor Foundation. So we were running these parallel organizations. And the Betsy group had their office right in the Central Park Arsenal there, where the park department headquarters is. So Gordon and Betsy could chat, and they saw each of them this sort of tennis match of ambition and a vision. And so they said, well, let's dust off this Savas study. One of the recommendations was a board of guardians. And so Betsy took that with Gordon's tremendous encouragement, which meant Mayor Koch's encouragement. Not that Betsy really needed any. You can tell. I mean, she's one of these tigresses, and you don't want to get anywhere around her way once she's got something in mind. And this, luckily, she has damn good things in mind. So she started to build this board, Bill Beinecke and so forth, Louis Bernard, and things began to happen. A really big plus was when the Women's Committee got organized. And this is another thing I've learned from the park activity. And that is that if you want to accomplish something in this town, make sure the women are with you. I don't say that in a patronizing way. If the women are with you, that says they sense that whatever this project is, it's going to be good for the social fabric of New York, and therefore they're going to get involved. And when they got involved, it brought Betsy and Lewis's and all of our whole effort to a new height. It wasn't that they were raising so much money at first, although of course today happened to be their annual lunch in which they raised $2 million. But it was just the stamp of approval. It's a marvelous organization, great spirit, and it was just fun to watch them grow and develop. So it was just a very important and good thing. The final thing was this. Betsy began to, I thought, run out of steam a little bit. She'd done most of the park, but there were still important parts left to do. And if you're lucky to have a Betsy, you know, or an Ellen, or any of the terrific people that are here tonight that I've had the privilege of working with, who run major institutions, who are first class, you want to just keep throwing red meat at them as long as their mouth can open, you know. And Betsy has this energy, but she was a little bit like Grant, you know, in 1864. He's kind of bottled up there in Petersburg and not getting anywhere. And so I said, Betsy, because you know we're very fond of it. I said, Betsy, what would it take to more or less finish the park? She said, well, we wouldn't finish it, but $50 million would go a long way. I said, fine, I'll go ask George for $50 million. Well, by then, George is in the newspapers, and I saw him, and he said, well, trying to keep a straight face, he said, well, you know, I'm all involved in Europe now, in Central Europe, and I want free society. That's what his whole point of bringing freedom all over the world, and especially to that part of the world. But I tell you what, I'll certainly make a contribution if you get started, and you'll need new governance, he said. So with that, Ira Milstein had, fortunately, Jim Evans, our second chairman, had picked Ira to be chairman, and Ira hadn't been on the board. So this was a great stroke of Jim's to see, because Ira had done some volunteer projects in the park. It was a very interesting move and a bold one, and it worked awfully well. Ira wanted to have new governance in the park because we had this very informal arrangement, public, private, all very nice, but what does it mean? And so Ira made sure this was codified and made rigid. So I kept thinking about it. Well, $50 million, of course, I can't do that. But maybe business was pretty good. It was going to take 4 or 5 years to do what Betsy had in mind. Could I somehow come up with $17 million over this period of time? And, you know, it shouldn't just be me. I mean, it's the city's park. They should be investing. They always do handle the capital part. And shouldn't the public be involved? In fact, if you don't have a match, and if you want to give money away, believe me, anybody will take it. So what we really need is critique, and the market judgment about this. Matching is a very good way to do that, I learned. So if you all aren't going to be with me then, maybe the idea stinks. And finally, it passed the acid test. My wife at the time, Virginia, now Mannheimer, a wonderful but, melancholy woman who, she's here tonight, and I'm thrilled she is, as is my first wife, Marie. And Virginia could easily be counted on to, any little balloon she would be in charge of bringing down. And thank goodness she did, because most of them deserved to be down. But this one passed muster. She said, well, you know something, that's not a bad idea. You know about the part, and you've got good leadership there. And so, well, with that, I knew I was home free. So the challenge worked awfully well. And so it all happened. And so those four things, you might take away from this. That is, if an idea is good, it'll keep building, irrespective of how you screw it up. And if an idea, I guess the corollary of that is, if the idea isn't good, no matter what you do for it, it ain't going to work. We didn't have that experience. The second thing is, don't fight City Hall. If they're against you, do something else for 4 or 5 years. Don't forget the women. If they're with you, you'll fly long and far, and you'll have a lot more fun about it. And always think about matching. It brings you back to earth, and it'll accomplish much more, because 17 million accomplishes 50 million. We had a study done that showed this would create $2 billion worth of goodness. So that was 50 million to 2 billion, or 17 million to 2 billion. Anyway, it was a good return. So as far as the planetarium is concerned, Bob Barker's here tonight, and he persuaded me to join the board. And I said, Bob, I'm from New York, animals, good, but just in case you didn't know it, the American Museum of Natural History had 750,000 dead birds. I just thought I'd tell you that. Nobody knows but they're there. So he said, no, it's not about animals, it's about growth. You're interested in growth, my weak spot. So I ended up joining the board of the planetarium, and the planetarium has its own committee. And my first meeting, luckily enough, there was a report underway by a visiting committee which had been spending the last few months studying the planetarium, headed by Richard Gott of Princeton, the #1 place in astronomy in the world. So they're giving their oral report. If you want to hear Louis Bernard's veteran school, if you want to hear a real report, hear the oral report. Don't worry about the written one. It's going to be very politically correct. But the oral one, pay attention to. And they were very critical and said, look, this was 1992 or 3. He said, in a few years, everybody's going to have a personal computer that can project pretty much what the Zeiss projector projects on their living room ceiling. No planetarium has any content. You're all just more or less showing cartoons. In fact, our attendance had dropped from 500,000 to 400,000 in those 10 years. So I knew he was right. He says, you're going to have curators, you're going to have tremendous intellectual competency here. And I knew, and the head of the planetarium was sitting there, and he was a well-meaning guy whose marching orders had been, for the many years before, he could just spend what he took in at basically the box office. So he had nothing to invest in anything of staff and research nature. So I took our chairman of the museum at that time, Bill Golden, who loved science, up to Columbia and talked to their astronomy people. And a couple of us went along, about 4 of us, Keith Gollis and Edgar Smith. Then we went down to Princeton. And Princeton had this guy, Jerry Oistreicher, who was head of the astronomy department, just a short guy, but bristling, every facet of his face was just a glow of ideas and sparkling with intelligence. And 8 astronomers, each of them had terrific ideas for us, what to do. And they all wanted to help the planetarium. They loved it. It's just part of their whole astronomical world. And the government wants to help because here's a chance to educate the public. And even with our pitiful 400,000 visitors at that point a year. So I like this guy, Jerry Oistreicher, and I said, listen, next time you're in New York, give me a call. Let's have lunch. So that happened, and a month or 2 later, I sat down with Jerry. And I said, listen, I have 0 authority. I'm a trustee. There's 45 or 50 trustees. Maybe by that time, they had made me chairman of the planetarium committee. I don't really remember. And Obie Clifford and I became co-chairman shortly thereafter. But I had, zero clout. Ellen Futter had just been hired, but she was just beginning to learn about everything, and she would need some time to master all the complexities of the museum, not to mention the planetarium. So I could talk through my hat as usual, and I said, we're going to need somebody because your visiting report said we need content, and our guy does not have a degree in astronomy. So consequently, he's not going to be able to hire anybody, to come and learn and be an exciting part of what our putative research effort that is going to be coming. So he said, okay. And a month or two later, he called, said, I got just the guy. He's a New Yorker, he's a Bronx Science, then Harvard, University of Texas, Columbia for his doctorate. He's a postdoc here. He's African American, which means he'll be a great role model for all these New Yorker kids. I said, good grief. Let me have dinner with him. So Neil Tyson came up, and we had dinner. Same routine. Neil, I don't have any authority. I'm just, a trustee, but you would be a fabulous, incredible resource, and you could be the best and most exciting planetarium guy. The sky is so exciting. Most of the stars you see, put the case, some of these stars are 12 billion miles away. The light from them keeps coming. The stars have been dead for years. So you have to visualize this whole sky as a big experimental battleground where stars are being created, destroyed, and there's a whole team of people that spend all their time studying these things, and then they ask the astronomers to go find proof that they're right or wrong. Einstein never looked through a telescope. So to get this across to kids, who might have a predilection for science, is a marvelous, challenging assignment. And Neil was just, many of you know him, you just can't resist his excitement. So he was, interested, but academics, had about tenure and so on. So, and meanwhile, Ellen had to be fair to our existing planetarium staff, and so time was needed. I had, at that time, we were giving a course. I had a chap from Columbia, and I said, we're going to need somebody because your visiting report said we need content, and our guy does not have a degree in astronomy. So consequently, he's not going to be able to hire anybody, to come and learn and be an exciting part of what our putative research effort that is going to be coming. So he said, okay. And a month or two later, he called, said, I got just the guy. He's a New Yorker, he's a Bronx Science, then Harvard, University of Texas, Columbia for his doctorate. He's a postdoc here. He's African American, which means he'll be a great role model for all these New Yorker kids. I said, good grief. Let me have dinner with him. So Neil Tyson came up, and we had dinner. Same routine. Neil, I don't have any authority. I'm just, a trustee, but you would be a fabulous, incredible resource, and you could be the best and most exciting planetarium guy. The sky is so exciting. Most of the stars you see, put the case, some of these stars are 12 billion miles away. The light from them keeps coming. The stars have been dead for years. So you have to visualize this whole sky as a big experimental battleground where stars are being created, destroyed, and there's a whole team of people that spend all their time studying these things, and then they ask the astronomers to go find proof that they're right or wrong. Einstein never looked through a telescope. So to get this across to kids, who might have a predilection for science, is a marvelous, challenging assignment. And Neil was just, many of you know him, you just can't resist his excitement. So he was, interested, but academics, had about tenure and so on. So, and meanwhile, Ellen had to be fair to our existing planetarium staff, and so time was needed. I had, at that time, we were giving a course. I had a chap from Columbia, from the astronomical department come down, and he lectured, I think, every Thursday at our office, and I invited our trustees and the planetarium committee folks, and we usually had 8 or 10, a good man, and He took us around the solar system. We learned about all the moons of Jupiter and so forth. And Obie Clifford took notes, and he was the best student by far. And one day, the professor called. He couldn't come. So I got a hold of Neil and said, listen, come next Thursday if you can. If you can sit in and just serve as a substitute teacher. And I made sure Ellen was there and all the big shots. And there was Neil, you know. So he's underway lecturing. And you can't help, you know, you've seen him. And then one of our more experienced women, but she, you know, couldn't help. She said, Dr. Tyson, what about these unidentified flying objects? You know, these UFOs. What do you think about that? You know, and everybody kind of, ooh. So he said, well, look, no astronomer would deny that somewhere out there could be life. I mean, billions of galaxies, and who knows, all the solar systems and other life-producing and creating entities that could be there. But when it comes to these UFOs, we're also trained to look for the obvious. My best professor told me, Neil, look for the obvious. 99 times out of 100, that will be your answer. So, he said, put the case somewhere way out there. Someone decides they're going to send some kind of vehicle to this galaxy, Milky Way, and then to this particular solar system, and then to Earth. And this is going to take, I don't know how many resources and years, centuries, tens of centuries to do all. So this vehicle comes all this way and finally somehow gets through into the atmosphere and doesn't blow up and so forth. And then it goes to Utah. And then it turns around and goes all the way back. He got the job. And right away, we began to think about improving the planetarium. The first, you might say, orbit around that one was a $15 million, you know, kind of re-chrome sort of thing. Bring in the old Chevy, you know, shine it up a little. But then our architect, Jim Polchek, kept coming up with interesting ideas, and the market was kind of expanding. In other words, you could tell people's imaginations were beginning to grow. And the subject is so exciting. And the idea just kept building. And before you know it, it was 60 million. It became the Rose Space Center, 80 million, 100. I forget what the final, I mean, Lewis and Ellen, you know, together have raised $600 million. And I'm probably low. Ellen, I'm probably 100 million, because that's the last I heard, which is a couple of months ago. I'm sure it's more than that now. But can you imagine? This organization never had a fundraising in 40 years, and they've raised hundreds, and some of which, and the nice thing about the planetarium is, some came from the city, some came from the state, some came from NASA. It was a very broad effort from people that had a few bucks and people that hadn't. Just a tremendous thing. And it and Central Park have this in common, that each of them turned out so much better than anybody thought they would. It's just a great triumph, you know, of the human spirit, which is a trite line, but true. So from the planetarium, I think we learned that the bigger the idea, the easier it is to raise money for. Admittedly, times have to be propitious, but make sure the idea is big. If the idea is big, the money's there. You know, we're stock speculators and investors. We want a big idea. These are the big companies. These are the great success stories. We're not valued players in the philanthropic world. So those are the two lessons really from, from the planetarium. One, that a single person, a trustee, can get a lot done as long as he doesn't overplay his hand. You know, just stick with it. If the idea is good, we go back to the first thing, it'll grow anyway. And if it isn't, it'll die, so what? You know, we all know from Wall Street, you know, you've got egg in your face half the time anyway. So what's another failure? But the upside is so tremendous. And finally, I wanted to say a word or two about this concept of giving back. You know, so many times in philanthropic circles, you know, well, I've done well, I want to give something back. For some reason, that irritates me deeply, because those of us who have made a few bucks in business, in other words, we're hollowing out the influences. We're hollowing out the economy or the country. And if we don't give something back, it's all going to implode. I mean, most people who've built businesses have hired people. They employ. The employees hire other employees. They have satisfied and happy, by and large, customers. They have suppliers. They have landlords. They're in business. They don't have to give anything back. So then why give? And here the answer is much more exciting and much more important. Greed. Greed, but make it long-term greed. Once you go at greed, now you want a return on your investment. You want a return for the next generation or whatever. Not for you. Who cares about you? Once you have enough money, who cares? But this big idea for the future. And therefore, we're always asked in importune to give to this and give to that. But if you're thinking about greed, what's the return going to be here? What are we going to get out of this for the world? It really focuses the mind. Very few dollars have been made by investing in guilt. So you invest in greed and keep that long-term greed, we'll all be better off. And as a corollary, look at all the friends I've made. Because when you have a friendship that's based on business, in other words, based on projects, it's like being in battle together. You come out fast friends. And all of you here, not all, but so many of you here are really good friends of mine. I don't say that, you know, to be patronizing or to just, you know, be modestly flat. I mean, we've done these things together, and lots of people take credit for these projects. You know what? They're right. It takes tons of people to get these things done. Lots and lots of people. It's important work, and God bless them all. And so I thank all of you for coming tonight. You're helping the Manhattan Institute, which itself is a marvelous organization. Roger, I thank you so much for your words. It's such a luxury, and more than that, an honor to be understood. And I just know the thought you've given to this. And thank you for this prize. And folks, onward and upward. Let's go be green.